reminder that Tulane University promotes and protects the free exchange of ideas. Freedom of expression includes the ability to engage or not to engage in the exchange, examination, and discussion of ideas. It does not include the right to disrupt the freedom of others. Therefore, we prohibit the physical or virtual disruption, shouting down, blocking, or suppressing of a protest, a demonstration, program, or an invited speaker's right to speak. Please note that disruptions of this nature may result in the removal from the event.
Good afternoon. Thank you again for joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce our next session, Tariff Policy Impacts on Global Energy Trade. If time allows, at the end of the session, our speakers will take questions submitted by the audience. So we will have the QR codes up on the screens. You can use those to submit questions. Please do be sure to silence your cell phones if you haven't already. Enjoy the conversation, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to our moderator, Dr. Hsieh, Director of the U.S.-China Energy Industry Forum.
Thank you. Thank you. So, shall we start? Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us at this wonderful forum. I have the honor and the privilege to introduce the next speaker, Mr. Kevin Book. He graduated from Tufts University with the economics major, and then MA on economy and law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Now he, after successful career in working in investment bank, working as an senior energy analyst, 20 years ago, he co-founded this Clearview Energy Partners LLC. He's now the director of research. This is a research firm, not a lobbyist or anything. And his publications are well circulated in the utility and corporate world. And he appears often in radio talks, conferences, and he called by the Senate and Congress meetings to testify, and he talks to, in DC, top decision makers. That's why his opinion is well respected. And I hope he can share with us a quite different subject from all this talking, what's happening in DC, the geopolitics of this global energy business. Thank you. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Hsieh. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I apologize that TU from Tufts starts out so well. It looks like it's going to be Tulane, and then it's the wrong school. But I'll do my best to try to keep just to the first two letters. They say Washington is Hollywood for ugly people. I have no comment, but if you remember the highly factual 2005 movie Syriana, Matt Damon plays an energy analyst. I think it's a very flattering comparison, even if what I just said is sort of unflattering. We find ourselves at a very interesting point in history. The United States has become a net energy exporter. Approximately equivalent to 10% of domestic consumption goes out through exports every year. That very different profile is probably part of what the current administration means when they use the words energy dominance. Has anyone seen an official definition of the words energy dominance? I haven't, so we get to fill it in. And it looks like it's some combination of export-focused production policy or maybe production-focused export policy. It's not clear, but it has those two components. But the current administration happens to be also at work on trade relations in a fairly significant way. We've gone from one of the lowest tariff countries in the world to one with fairly significant barriers in place. This did not start in the current administration. It did not focus exclusively on energy, but it has impacts for energy. So much of the energy export business that I just mentioned in the first part of my remarks is affected or could be affected by frictional costs to the transmission of energy across sea lines of communication, and other mechanisms of trade that in energy goods That could all be an impact. Frictional costs in terms of demand headwinds can also impact the economics for energy production. So whether or not you're looking at sourcing pipes and steel for production in the United States at a higher cost level because of tariffs in place right now, whether you're looking at a global demand slowdown, which, to be fair, it's early days, hasn't obviously materially appeared. There are some demand slowdowns that we can see in oil consumption, but to link them directly to tariffs or trade war seems premature and probably not well substantiated at this juncture. But whether you're talking about it on the supply side or the demand side, there are very real impacts. And it's reasonable to ask the question, well, how are these two things consistent? How can we become a bigger player in the energy marketplace and also be in a position where we're rationalizing our trade balances with the world? And the answer is, well, there's a lot more things going on than just energy and a lot more things going on than just trade. So as a framing thought, I'd offer this. We find ourselves at a point in history where the global order that most of us have been living within for our whole lives appears to be fragmenting and repartitioning into a new set of alliances, loosely governed by relationships that in some cases hadn't been that tightly binding or becoming more so. So if you think about it in a very simplistic way, you can think about sort of a G7 and NATO-led Western organization squaring off increasingly against some combination of BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization member states. It sounds a little grim, a little Cold War-y when you put it in those terms. I'm not trying to get grim, certainly not in the afternoon on the last day of the conference when I'm just a couple of speakers away, I think, from where the drinks start. Although this could help you drink, I suppose, if you look at it that way. But in that dynamic, you might want to ask, well, what does this mean for energy trade? At the height of the Cold War, at the height of the sort of the tensions between the West and the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, we still saw a lot of westbound flows out of where the molecules began to the demand centers where they ended up. We saw the construction of pipelines, we saw transit and commerce. Are there new barriers, are there new obstacles to energy trade, and where might they show up? A reasonable question. I think we'll get into that in some of your questions and as the discussion progresses. But the impediments of sort of an economics-based value chain in investment decisions, moving from sort of a just-in-time, globally sourced world to a values or ideology-based agglomeration of players, where you have just-in-case resilience-based investments. It's a very different set of paradigms. It certainly could affect energy. If you go to the comments at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit just a couple weeks ago that President Hsieh made, he emphasized that energy was one of the strengths of that grouping, of the association of countries. It was one area where they were strong, and demand-intensive, import-intensive economies were dependent. So could we be entering into a new paradigm? Well, there's another layer on top of that. Tariffs are just one form of economic force projection. But other modalities have gained a lot of traction in recent years. One of them, of course, are economic sanctions that we're seeing in place. So the United States, because of the dollar clearing, because of our prominence in global trade, because of the size of our economy, because our wiring and our financial networks extends into so many other realms, has had leverage that's enabled a lot of use of economic force in place of more military or kinetic resources that we would have fought past conflicts with. And so we are seeing some fragmentation to energy trade as a result of those sanctions. Now, how do I combine my peanut butter of tariffs with my chocolate of sanctions? If only there were some recent development that comes to mind. We've seen some innovation in this respect. This year brought the dawn of something called secondary tariffs. Now, if you don't know what that means, and you're not even sure what the primary and secondary parts are, I'll stop with just a brief sidebar and come back into it. When you talk about a primary sanction, a primary economic sanction, you're limiting on a first-order basis interactions between buyer and seller. You're essentially blocking off commerce with the United States if it's the United States that imposes a primary sanction. A secondary sanction is a sanction on the countries or entities that do business with the sanctioned seller or buyer, the counterparty who is sanctioned. So technically third parties, it gets confusing, third parties are the ones who are subject to secondary sanctions. If you're pausing at this point and going, what is he even talking about? I'm doing my best, but it is a bit arcane. In any case, the idea of secondary sanctions, of using contagious sanctions that spread from the targeted party to the parties that that party does business with, that has gained a lot of traction in the last couple of decades. So what then is a secondary tariff? A secondary tariff is in place right now against India from the United States. There's a 25% surcharge that we are imposing on goods that the United States imports from India on the basis of India's relationship, its oil relationship as an importer of Russian oil, which is a bit confusing because of the sanctions that were in place as a result of the Ukraine conflict. And here I'll close out of this, again, somewhat arcane discussion, come back up to a higher level and get to sort of the implications in a minute. But bear with me for just 1 second. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the immediate sanctions response from the West threatened to cut off a significant amount of Russian oil transit to the world, possibly as many as 3.5 million maritime barrels per day of oil supplied to the world, which could have had a dramatic effect on oil prices, $25, $30, $40, $50 a barrel. It's hard to know exactly. We saw an observed effect just because of the aura of uncertainty that surrounded the imposition of sanctions. One of the mechanisms the European Union put in place was to block the use of maritime services, the use of insurance and shipping services that were subject to regulation in the European Union for those Russian cargoes to those other countries, third countries other than European countries. And that could have cut off all of that maritime oil. It was pretty significant in a wonky Washington way, significant enough that for the first time in my career, I can remember the European Union had put in place stronger sanctions than Washington had. They worked out as an alternative an effort to target not the quantity of oil going out to the world, but the price at which that oil was sold, something called a price cap. The idea was that below a certain threshold level, Russia could sell its barrels to buyers in third markets, and that would reduce the revenues to the Kremlin for the prosecution of the war in Ukraine. So the model was to keep barrels flowing to the world while reducing revenues at the same time. You might argue that of those two purposes, the keeping barrels flowing to markets may have had a slightly higher priority than reducing revenues, because in Western consuming economies, we don't like high energy prices. Is there anyone in the room who would like to pay higher prices for energy? I see no hands. Let the record reflect no hands. So where we are right now is a change from what was an innovative use of economic force projection that had very significant impacts on the global energy system. Cargoes that went to Europe shifted around the world, started going to India, more volume started going to China. And now in this administration, we are seeing economic force projection that also seeks to reshape energy flows to the world. It is a very volatile time in global affairs, I think it's safe to say, historically speaking, at least particularly from a Western perspective, but it is also an extremely volatile time in energy investment as a result of these many changes. And so that is where we are. Now, the fundamental proposition, I think a lot of what everybody at this conference has been talking about today is the question of investment and how to further it. I mean, that's, after all, what people at business schools do talk about. It's what people in business think about. And much of the time, government is blamed as being a frictional drag or a limiting factor or some form of obstacle to investment and return. The question is whether what we're seeing here at a time of more uncertainty, greater flux, more intervention, we're seeing a truly destructive or limiting force on investment, whether what we're just seeing is a shifting of investment from one destination market to another, from one modality to a different one, perhaps different types of energy resources in the mix. It's early. It's safe to say that I think, again, it'd be premature to conclude that demand has been stalled or frozen by this, but there's a great deal of uncertainty for people who are thinking about putting money to work. And as we are seeing an evolution in economic structures to try to combat or to oppose political and geopolitical dynamics, I'm trying to say this politely and neutrally, it sometimes can get a bit difficult, actually, when you think about the parlance of the present. But in any case, at this point in time, there are new threats to investment in energy, and it comes at a time when, of course, the U.S. has been so prolific and so successful in energy. And with that, I think I'll stop there and open it up to either your questions and discussion or anyone else's.
Let's try from the floor. Is there any questions?
We have not got any questions so far, so we invite the audience to scan the QR code if you do have any questions.
Well, if you like, I can go on, but...
Yeah, go on, please.
Okay. Well, so one of the questions I think that you might be asking is, what's going on? You spoke in general terms. Can you give me some specifics, please? the first use of really sort of energy trade war as an active modality came after a very significant fiscal stimulus, not in the COVID crisis, but in the banking crisis before it. In the 2008 Great Recession, what we saw were that a lot of governments put tomorrow's money into yesterday's and today's and tomorrow's factories, and tended to induce a certain amount of protectionism. If you're going to spend that amount of money on your own economy, you're going to protect that economy. And it was in that context, in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act here in the United States, in the $2 trillion in G20 spend we saw to support the major economies in the Great Recession, that you started to see solar trade cases showing up. The first big cases against solar manufacturing in China that started to emerge here in the United States resulted in anti-dumping and countervailing duties, surcharges placed on Chinese exporters for their sales of products into the United States. The argument US manufacturers were making was that they were being undercut by imports that were being dumped on the economy, that there were subsidies or policies in place in manufacturing in China that were undercutting or giving an uncompetitive or an anti-competitive advantage to domestic players. So if you look at that sort of first flash of major energy trade war, it comes out of solar, ironically. And you may say, well, okay, yeah, but that was the Obama years. Obama liked solar. It's a Democrat thing. It's a green energy thing. Yeah, Kevin, but what happened next? What's the next chapter? And actually, the next chapter is solar. It turns out that in 2018, the Trump administration put in place a second type of tariff, a tariff under Section 201 of a law called the 1974 Trade Act. And the tariff in question is one that's called a safeguards tariff. And the purpose of this tariff, it's a charge at the border, is to protect a domestic industry that is evolving. In this case, it was the evolving solar industry. So these Section 201 safeguards tariffs were put in place as sort of the second wave of energy trade war. Now, if you ask, okay, was that the only thing that Trump went after? Trump was defending solar and only solar? The answer is no. Actually, in that action, in that tariff action, January of 2018, also included washing machines, which I realize is not the subject of this conference, although they're important and they use energy. But in any case, on top of that, there was a separate provision of that same law, the 1974 Trade Act, that the Trump administration used to more broadly target exports from China, Section 301. And this was premised on market access and concerns about fairness in trade writ large. Both the 201 and 301 provisions involved using a series of agency actions to investigate alleged grievances on the part of parties, but not driven by the parties themselves, driven by presidential authority. So unlike the anti-dumping and countervailing duties, which came from injured parties here in the US who said to the Commerce Department, please investigate this, we need some help, this was done on a presidential choice. It also came on the heels of a third law. And if you're having trouble keeping up, if you have a scorecard and you're like, he said anti-dumping and countervailing duties, then he said 201, then he said 301, what are you going to take to get bingo? Does anyone have 232 on their bingo card? Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act was used by the Trump administration to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum. You may say, well, that's not energy per se, but when you consider the energy intensity of primary metals manufacturing, it's basically energy in a different form. When you're transmitting aluminum across the ocean, you're also transmitting energy. And so the premise of the Section 232 tariffs was that the imports of steel and aluminum threatened to impair the national security of the United States. This is a provision that actually comes out of the multilateral trading regime known as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade from 1947. It's a bit of a contentious issue. Can you get in the way of regular trade rules to protect your national security? The United States has long argued yes, and they did so in this fashion. So it was in the first Trump term that we saw the rollout of these tools. Across the ocean, and I'll close in just a moment here, I won't get to the second term yet, to give time for a question. I don't want to bore any of you to tears. What, I'm here for a conference, this sounds like a lecture. But if you go across the ocean, in 2019, now European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen campaigned on something she called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a Green Deal that included putting tariffs on the border in the European Union to protect domestic industry there. In 2005, the European Union imposed a price on carbon for domestic heavy industries. So the emissions trading scheme it was originally called. Now most people call it the emissions trading system because scheme sounds a little skeevy. But the ETS. And those domestic prices were borne by manufacturers, heavy industry inside the European EU 27, now 28 then. And to some extent, that created an economic disadvantage. It created a risk that heavy industry would migrate to less regulated economies and disadvantage the European economies that were heavily regulated. And emissions would effectively leak. I think some of you probably heard the term emissions leakage. And so the idea was that the European Union would put in place a price at the border that would compensate for goods that were less regulated, that didn't pay a price in their originating countries, in their originating economies. This is where energy trade war became carbon trade war. And effectively, the price at the border that was initially proposed in June of 2021, the European Commission proposed the regulation. It went into effect on a trial basis in October of 2023. It goes into effect full-time, for real, in January of 2026, so coming very soon. And what'll happen is importers of goods from carbon-intensive economies will have to procure certificates equivalent to the price of the emissions allowances in Europe for those goods if they don't have sufficient coverage. If they haven't paid the price at home, they'll have to pay it at the door. It's not explicitly a tariff. Complicated World Trade Organization rules are the reason. Again, I won't bore you, but the point is that carbon trade war is now alive and well on top of energy trade war. So what we're seeing are these very significant changes in the structure of the economics of both energy goods and energy trade itself. And that takes me up to essentially pre-Trump 2.0 and our next break maybe for questions.
Yeah, any questions from the floor, please?
We do have some questions.
Okay, please.
First question is, how big is the LNG trade versus oil? And how do you think about the potential LNG export glut and impacts of exports on U.S. natural gas prices?
Okay, that's a great question. So essentially, there's a lot of ways to answer it, first of all. If you think about oil consumption, about 70% of oil consumption crosses borders, about 35% of natural gas production does, and only about a third of that does in the form of LNG. So on a BTU basis, oil trade is still the biggest, most widely traded commodity in the world. It's a very big deal. What is different, though, is that the infrastructure intensity of LNG is much, much higher. You have to put much more money to work to liquefy natural gas, many billions of dollars to create multiple process trains, to freeze it down to a much denser, much more transportable form. You don't have to do that for oil. So oil tends to be much more fungible and much more available as a resource for export, re-export, and trade. You need more specialized infrastructure writ large for gas, and that's a limiting factor. But the other part of that is that it enables LNG to be much more disruptive because so much of gas that does move, when it does cross borders, moves by pipeline. LNG provides a new opportunity to disrupt otherwise static trade relationships. Now, if you ask, like, okay, so that was a BTU question and an infrastructure question that you answered, but how much are we actually exporting in, sort of cash money dollars terms? This morning, I'm an affiliate at a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We have a bi-weekly video cast that I do there with the head of the Energy and Climate Change Program, Joseph Mykett, which is called Energy Shots, like the energy shots you guys, some of you use, maybe none of you, because you all get plenty of sleep. I know no students are ever staying up late. But in any case, today we talked about that, and in June, for example, the size of oil trade in dollars is about 3 times the size of LNG trade out of the U.S., and part of that has to do with the higher price of oil as a commodity. Part of that has to do with the greater volume that we're exporting right now of oil and petroleum products writ large. We've been a major exporter of petroleum products and became a net exporter of petroleum in 2019 briefly, flickered on and off again in 2020, and we've been a net petroleum exporter ever since. We've been a net natural gas exporter since 2019, thanks to LNG. We have a lot of new LNG capacity coming on stream, and so I think the value of goods exports in LNG will start to converge towards the value of oil exports, but some of that does have to do with the price in the market, which will shape the overall market. So there was your BTU answer, infrastructure answer, and dollar answer.
Perfect. Any more?
Yep. Do tariffs make it harder for large-scale renewable energy and solar projects within the U.S.?
The answer in short is they absolutely can. The tariffs in place, the Section 201 safeguard tariffs that I mentioned, when Biden came into office with a very explicit stated goal to make climate change mitigation the center of U.S. policy and to accelerate a clean energy transition to try to achieve a 50 to 52% reduction below 2005 emissions levels by 2030. One of the problems that they had in place was that a significant number of solar products, most of them, were imported from other countries and faced different tariffs under different provisions of law. And so one of those tariffs was the Section 201 safeguard, which was across the board. It wasn't just country specific. During the Biden years, solar products also received additional constraints, what would be called non-tariff barriers, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which essentially targeted solar products from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region that were believed to have been made with forced labor and excluded their import entirely, provided a barrier to entry. Along the way, there were also provisions attached by the Inflation Reduction Act, not tariffs per se, but also strictures that defined whether or not goods would qualify for import, or imported goods would qualify for full credit value. So you can see a lot of renewable technologies can be targeted in a lot of different ways besides tariffs. All these things on a cumulative basis created headwinds to the installation and delivery, but they didn't really stop solar procurement. In a lot of ways, first of all, the Biden administration in I think it was June of 2022, declared, if this sounds familiar, if this sounds like a play out of a current playbook, it should, declared an emergency, because of an emergency, an energy emergency in Ukraine, they would waive the tariffs, new tariffs on imported solar goods starting in June of 2022. That was challenged by domestic manufacturers, and I believe has recently been reversed. But that waiver of existing tariffs was done to facilitate imports, to try to accelerate that clean energy transition. But yeah, so part of the problem is very simple. If you have tariffs at the border here in the United States or any other importing country, and your goal is to try to green up your grid, try to transition your technology and your energy mix, and you have a tariff in place on the goods that you're importing because you don't make enough of them here, you're going to see disadvantaged factor costs. And in some cases, they can be quite very significant. Some of the anti-dumping and countervailing duties that are either company or country specific could be in the hundreds of percent, so prohibitive for imports along those value chains. If those value chains then move to other markets to try to get around those tariffs, you find that there's anti-circumvention proceedings undertaken to try to limit imports there too. It's a process, but when it happens, it does have a limiting factor. Now, if you ask, well, is that a bigger impact on a net basis? I haven't done the math, but we saw a massive acceleration in deployment of solar technologies when, despite those tariffs, there were very significant incentives in place under the Inflation Reduction Act. Take away those incentives while barriers to trade exist, and I think the cumulative effect is projected to be quite significant.
Thank you. Maybe we should follow on with Trump too.
Okay, so where were we when we picked up our last episode? We just started the carbon border adjustment saga in Europe and it going into force now. You might ask, can something like that happen here? Surely there's nobody from an oil-producing and refining-intensive state who would ever propose to do such a thing as put a climate-based tax at the border on imported goods here in Louisiana. Could something like that happen here? Would Senator Bill Cassidy ever dare to talk about a carbon border adjustment mechanism? Anyone want to answer that question for me? Would he dare? Oh, dare he would. Dare he did. It's called the Foreign Pollution Fee Act. And if you ask, what is it really? It is a carbon border adjustment mechanism proposal that came out a couple of years ago, but it's been translated into Republican. So the use of the words foreign pollution fee, not tax, foreign pollution, not carbon emissions, to address essentially the same issue. And one of the questions is, well, what kind of traction could you expect for that? That seems like a crazy thing for Republicans to propose. But if you look at the broader energy intensity and carbon intensity of GDP here in the United States, so the amount of energy we use or the emissions of greenhouse gases that come out of the generation of $1 of our economic output, it's approximately, in both cases, approximately 1/3 what the energy and emissions intensities are of some of the groupings I mentioned before, the BRICS countries in the aggregate, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries, the non-G7, G20 economies, China itself. It's essentially a 3x intensity relative to the US, which means that if there were such a border adjustment in place, it would provide an advantage to domestic energy-intensive industries, what are historically referred to as energy-intensive trade-exposed industries. Now, Senator Cassidy's proposal is not going very far. Right now, Republicans are not in sort of a climate-forward modality on Capitol Hill, but it is a tariff tool. And this is a president who likes tariff tools. So let's go to February 1st, shall we? February 1st of this year, President Trump puts in place tariffs using a law called the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which has the wonderfully sonorous acronym IEEPA, which starts with IE, like, oh my God, what's about to happen here? It's an emergency law, much like Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act. It's premised on a national security goal, which is to protect the United States in emergencies. It replaced, actually, or didn't replace, it was added to a suite of tools that included a law called the Trading with the Enemy Act, which was a predecessor law. And among the things that it says in the International Emergency Economic Powers Act is that the president can use it to regulate importation and exportation. And the Trump administration took the novel interpretation that regulating importation and exportation means that they can put tariffs in place, because, well, tariffs are a form of regulation. This has undergone some jurisprudence, first in the Court of Original Jurisdiction, the Court of International Trade, where that interpretation was overturned. The court said that's not right. And then it went to the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, and on August 29th, that court overturned it again and said, well, that's not quite right. Again, there's a lot of details there, and I don't want to bore you too much. But this is the principal tool that the president used, not only to put in place tariffs based on the imports or the trafficking in fentanyl from other countries, but also what he called reciprocal tariffs, tariffs intended to rebalance balance of trade deficits that were in place to advantage the U.S. economy and to reshore jobs, to promote domestic investment, and to provide a catalyst for trade deals. The president put in place this massive apparatus of tariffs on April 2nd, on a day he called Liberation Day, when he unveiled the reciprocal tariffs in the White House Rose Garden. He suspended them for 3 months on April 9th, after some market perturbations, led Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent to suggest that maybe a little cooling off period would be worthwhile. Negotiations began with other economies, and including negotiations with the European Union, where the European Union agreed over the course of the remainder of the Trump term to buy $750 billion in energy goods on the premise of reducing the tariff that they faced under IEEPA, this new mechanism for tariffs, to 15%. So there would be essentially a way of buying down tariffs. Japan agreed also to give a certain amount of money for the purpose of investment in the United States to buy down tariffs to 15%. So we saw multiple deals. It turns out that South Korea agreed to do $100 billion over the remainder of the term in energy investments as part of reducing the tariffs that were put in place under IEEPA, these reciprocal tariffs. So between April and essentially August, when the tariffs finally went back into force for everywhere except China, China was separately suspended in May, extended in August, and now the China reciprocal tariffs are suspended through November 10th. But in any case, during this process of negotiation, there's this process happening in parallel of adjudication. This very significant tool that the administration has been using to negotiate essentially global trade flows and relationships between the U.S. and the world, including these very big energy bargains, including these very energy-relevant trade provisions, has been overturned by 2 courts and is going through the appellate process. On September 3rd, the administration said, yeah, well, what we want to do is appeal this to the Supreme Court in a hurry. We want to take this federal Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit decision, and we want to have it reviewed. We'd like it expedited. We'd like to have oral argument by November and try to get to a decision as fast as possible. On, I believe it was September 10th, the Supreme Court said, yes, we'll take the case, we'll expedite it, we'll follow the schedule. The plaintiffs in the original case, small business called VOS Selections, and the many Democrat-led so-called blue states that had also in a parallel case sued against the tariffs, agreed to the schedule. And so now we're going to come to the thrilling climax and eventual denouement of this tariff question. What will happen when the Supreme Court decides whether or not this mechanism is legal? And it is a very consequential question for everybody in the energy industry and in every industry everywhere else besides. So slow and boring, no. The writers are very good. And I think you'll find that there's going to be a lot of questions about what it means to regulate importation. What does the word regulate mean? Meanwhile, though, as Trump has been setting out these baseline global and reciprocal tariffs using IEEPA, he's also been putting in place multiple tiers of Section 232 tariffs, including a new investigation that began a couple of months ago into polysilicon, among other things, which can be used for solar products as well as semiconductors, and more recently, wind turbines, a wind turbine investigation. There's a critical minerals investigation, which includes uranium in its scope. So there's multiple tiers of tariffs under a much less contentious topic. The Section 232 has been tried, and in a case several decades ago, was found to be valid under the law by the Supreme Court, and is an available tool. There are other mechanisms that will be energy-relevant tariffs in addition. And what the White House has been doing is they've been saying, we're going to negotiate with you on the IEEPA tariffs, and we'll get you a lower rate if you go along with terms that we think are advantageous to the U.S. economy. But you're going to have to pay some of these Section 232 tariffs, and maybe we'll flex some of them as some parts of the trade deal. On September 5th, the president put out an executive order giving more flexibility on Section 232 tariffs for things that we don't make in sufficient quantity here in the United States, including gold. Do any of you mine gold? Just asking. Right? Because if you do, and you have any extras, I'm ready to take home some souvenirs. Anyway, so there have been some provisions to make the Section 232 tariffs more flexible along the way. But there actually is no mechanism in place to truly replace the IEEPA tariffs if they're overturned by the Supreme Court. Now, I cannot prejudge the jurisprudence of the court, wouldn't begin to try. I think the dissent in the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit case was very extensive and maybe, in some cases, persuasive to some of the justices on the nation's highest court. But at Clearview, we do not try to get into the heads of judges or justices. We let them speak first and analyze later. But there's a reasonable chance that it could be sustained. There's a reasonable chance it could be overturned. And then what does the president do? There are other tariff-setting mechanisms that exist. That 74 law I mentioned, the Section 122, allows for 15% tariffs for up to 150 days. That sounds like a weird number. That's like 5 months. Why 150? History goes back to, in part, tariffs that Nixon put in place using the Trading with the Enemy Act. When Congress enacted it, it used that episode in history as a sort of a template. But in any case, there are other mechanisms in place. One of the mechanisms that is not currently in play is carbon border adjustments. I don't know that Senator Cassidy is getting a lot of calls from the White House like, Senator, can you please bring your bill to the floor? We need tariffs in a hurry. But there's a possibility that in a couple of years, if the tariff landscape looks different, perhaps if the political makeup of the Congress looks different, and maybe if the options available to the president look different, we could start to see the exploration of Senator Cassidy's idea, even by the Republican Party as it stands today. And if that sounds unusual or ridiculous or very far from the president, I would agree. All those things sound very far-fetched, a very small odds proposition, but a very high consequence one if it were to happen. And from there, I will pause again, having brought us up to speed more or less.
Okay. Is there any new questions from the floor, please?
We have plenty of questions. Do you have a way to quantify or qualify if tariffs are quote-unquote working?
No. There are ways that have been proposed. One is to count investment dollars going into the U.S. Another is to count economic performance metrics and say, are they going up or down? In both cases, whether it's foreign direct investment, whether it's the performance in terms of jobs numbers or economic growth, there are a lot of other variables besides tariffs that you have to consider. and it would be intellectually dishonest to assume that everything could be attributed to one thing. So it's a difficult exercise, best reserved for academic economists, if only there were a world-class university full of them.
What keeps your passion for green energy going? Can you talk about the dangers of a world without it?
I'm actually by charter supposed to be passionless. I try to be exciting as a speaker, provocative and intellectually curious, but Clearview doesn't take a side. So we are neither advocates for or against anything. Our goal is to try to identify impacts to supply, demand, or price driven by economic and policy trends and just stay as neutral as possible. So although I will tell you that as a young child, when I got a toy from Radio Shack called a 150-in-1 electronics kit, which used spring terminals and wires to allow you to connect different components of electronic components together to make little circuits, the solar panel was very, very cool. I love the idea that my little solar panel would give me energy for free, and I didn't have to buy batteries. My passion for solar at the current level I have is muted by my charter. But I do think that most people who approach energy policy and energy strategy believe that there are many things that are important. The three that you hear most about, affordability, reliability, and sustainability. But when you ask which of these things is the most important is always having enough. And whether you define that in terms of affordability, whether you define it in terms of sustainability or reliability, it's up to you. And diversification of resources is generally a good strategy in almost all contexts. It's also a good national security policy to use what you have. And so some balance between those two things, diversification and localization to existing supply strengths, is usually a good strategy. But I'm afraid I must stay passionless.
If I may pose a question to you, because you made the history very clear, very properly addressed, but where to the public who got the news reports say trade war is not fair, tariff is going to fail. How do you address the future of this current administration's approach to trade?
Well, their goal is to deliberately rebalance economic flows into and within the United States, and to use tariffs as a tool for that purpose. Historically, there have been challenges using tariffs, but it depends a lot on circumstances, too. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and I think if you go back to Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where famously Ben Stein asks the room, Bueller, you may also recall that he lectures about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in the course of that movie. If you haven't seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, all my cultural references are so out of date. I'm so Gen X, so pathetic, sorry. Anyway, the bottom line is that evaluating success or failure, I think, is going to be judged not in real time, not probably on the basis of daily real-time metrics or quarterly economic reports, but really on the question of whether the stated goals of rebalancing have been met. And again, it's not happening exclusively through the use of tariffs. There's other mechanisms at work. The intellectual theory behind the tariffs is not just that there's an economic relationship going on between the U.S. and its trade counterparties, but that there's a military relationship with military good. If you look at probably future, Federal Reserve Governor Stephen Myron, before he was Council of Economic Advisors Chairman Stephen Myron, he wrote a paper about essentially a rebalancing that considers some of the military shield that the U.S. provides to its allies as well, and how it monetizes that through trade and economic relationships. So there's a lot of questions, but I think that if you want to ask, are tariffs the way things usually go? Again, most of us have grown up at a time when taking down tariffs and non-tariff barriers was the explicit goal of foreign policy with relation to commerce. And so it's crazy to be talking about these things. How can this be happening, you say? This is nuts. But if you go back into history, 100 years or so, tariffs were the norm, and it wasn't that nuts. And the question, I think, is where are we in history? And so I will leave the question open until we have better data on efficacy and end results.
Thank you very much. Is there any more questions from the floor, or you wish to hear?
I think there were more still in the queue. Are there?
Plenty.
Oh, okay.
Plenty of questions. How has tariff policy impacted energy trade between the U.S. and Canada?
Interestingly, energy has been carved out in large part because of two structures that were put in place. The original AIPA tariffs gave a lower rate. Rather than the 25% that was going to be originally applied to Canadian energy goods in the United States, there was a 10% rate for Canadian energy goods. But then it turns out that actually goods that were compliant with the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, were exempted entirely. And so almost all of the energy goods in Canada that travel to the US originate in Canada, meet the rules of origin under the USMCA, and could be exempted if anyone had filed the paperwork. When there was an incentive to file the paperwork, I think a lot got filed. So at least in the short term, on the basis of that exemption, on the basis of that lower rate, it's had a very de minimis impact. There are some questions about trade in green goods. You could argue that biomass and lumber, depending how broadly you want to define it. I won't do that because there's more questions.
You had mentioned national security. How does taxing steel imports benefit national security?
The argument made in the original investigation in 2017 was that the capacity utilization in domestic steelworks had to be above a certain threshold level. I believe that level was 82%, to ensure that there were sufficient resources available for national security purposes. Now, there are a lot of people who say, well, that sounds like a made-up number or a made-up reason, but the investigation is a deliberate and thorough process, and that was the conclusion that they reached. And so the 25% tariff on imported steel that was imposed under the Section 232 proceedings then did bring an increase in capacity utilization in domestic steelworks, and I believe it did get above that threshold for some time until the pandemic sort of drove demand down, and with it capacity utilization. So that was the mechanism as it was explained, and the argument again was that you needed a healthy industry domestically to be able to serve national security goals.
What are the best information sources to help understand tariff policies, ongoing or proposed? What are some of the predictors of length of time any tariff will last? And what actions do tariff countries need to take to decrease or remove tariffs?
So in terms of resources, it's actually, there's not to pump CSIS, where I already mentioned once in this session, but there's another podcast they have called The Trade Guys, which I think is a great resource. Scott Lincecum, who's I believe a Cato Institute or AEP, I can't remember which think tank he's with, publishes a newsletter. There's a number of good resources, public resources out there, where you can get your handle on some of the sort of the tariff policies and where they stand from a very accessible, very reachable way. Actually digging into the weeds is pretty esoteric and difficult. I won't kid you. Reading just the executive orders, which are stacked upon one another and build cumulatively, is a full-time occupation for trade lawyers. It's been very good, I think, for trade lawyer employment policies. So I think you'll find that it's a little bit esoteric and difficult, but you can get through it. The Congressional Research Service, the think tank for Congress itself, writes white papers that I would commend to people who want to learn about topics that are esoteric, that involve federal policy in a very significant way, that can be broken down in a way that staffs for lawmakers can use and understand the details. There are a number of CRS reports on these tariffs. I commend them to you. I think they're good sources. And if you want to read some of the investigations themselves, they're all public. They're available on variously the U.S. Trade Representative website, the Department of Commerce website, depending on which authority was responsible for which tariff. A lot of work. I don't remember all of the questions, but I think that the third question in that question was what countries can do. It is not we're again not in the advocacy or the recommendation business, but I will say that administration officials have indicated that the story isn't over just because on August 1st they imposed the reciprocal tariffs they put in place. The deal making is still going on, and it does appear that in terms of rationalizing trade relationships one way or another, whether it's through the elimination of non-tariff barriers, elimination of tariffs, buying down through foreign direct investment in the United States, there are mechanisms available to counterparties, and those proceedings are still ongoing. Very prominently, the U.S.-India negotiation, which sort of went off the rails earlier in the year, over the summer, appears like it may be getting back on the rails, if not actually gliding smoothly. So some of the major trade partners of the U.S. Are still very much alive in negotiations.
All right, we're coming up to time, but I'll put two questions into one. What motivated you to co-fund your business, and how can we hear more from you?
So one of the great things about energy is it's one of the purest test beds for economic theory that you'll find. And as an economics student in school, I found a love for energy in life. It's also an essential part of everything that we live and do. We can't live without it. Life without energy is no life at all. And so it's a wonderfully rich area. When I was working as an investment bank research analyst covering macro energy issues, I thought if only there were a way to just talk about the issues and not have to try to talk about capital markets issues, which are their own very separate and complex and deep world. And to do that, I had to, with a couple of partners, start my own company. For anybody who wants to start their own company, I would recommend two things. One, first of all, I would recommend that you do it. It's a great experience. Second, though, I would recommend that you not do it in the bowels of the worst recession in 7 decades, which is when we did it. And third, I would recommend, as a second piece of advice, it might be useful to get a couple anchor clients before you do it, especially if you're starting it in the middle of the Great Recession, as we did. On the other hand, once you start in the middle of the Great Recession, you get pretty resilient in bumpier times subsequent to that. As far as how you can hear more from me, I do try to contribute to public discourse whenever invited, and I'm very happy to be here for that reason. I'm very grateful for the invitation today. I will speak at other conferences. They will be posted. I mentioned the Energy Shots videocast at CSIS. You will see me from time to time blathering. You probably will have the sound off, watching TV in the background with the crawler on the bottom, but you might see me there, and hopefully we'll have a chance to interact. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Time is up. Let's give this wonderful speaker full applause.
Thanks.
And we look forward to see you on the next forum, September 28th.
Thank you very kindly.
Okay? You promise, huh?
Thank you for joining us for this session. Our final session of the forum will begin in about 10 minutes. It'll be the Powering the Bayou State, Energy Investments Transforming Louisiana's Future. It'll begin in 10 minutes.